This video is sponsored by Squarespace, the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful website for your business. Hello and welcome to my art channel. In this video, I'm going to show you the entire process of this recent sketchbook illustration I did, and I specifically did it to test out these new watercolor paints I got very recently on my trip to Japan. These are Holbein watercolors, and they were in collaboration with one of my favorite artists, Yuko Higuchi. She's a Japanese artist and I highly recommend checking out her work. So I picked these up when I was in Japan and I was super excited to test them out because it's been ages since I've purchased any new watercolor paint specifically, and I don't even use watercolors that often actually, but it's something that I want to bring more of into my process, or at least into my sketchbook. And because this was a test, like a medium test type of piece, I decided to just do something easier, or like, I don't know, easier than trying to plan out a whole illustration. So what I picked was, since I recently watched Arcane and I really loved the series, I picked a screenshot from my favorite episode from the second season, and that's the illustration that I decided to do, just like a screen cap, draw this in your style type of study to give me a decided base to work with, and kind of like everything is already predetermined, like the color scheme and all that. So basically my biggest focus was just to figure out how to recreate it in my style using the paints, and I wasn't entirely sure what type of approach I was gonna take because I do have like a few different ways I tend to approach illustrations when it comes to traditional art, but for this one I decided to skip the inking part, because typically what I do is I'll make a sketch with a pencil and then I will just ink the line work of the illustration and then kind of go from there. But for this one in particular, I decided, like after I was done putting down the sketch, I decided to actually do the outlines with colored pencils, and I'm not sure exactly what made me decide that in particular, but I think it's because when I looked at the scene of the screenshot that I was studying, the background was dark and overall there was just a lot of saturated colors and dark areas, so I figured maybe it will end up looking a little more opaque instead of being like a really light watercolory type of situation. I know there are a lot of different ways in which people utilize watercolors. I think because anytime I've like flipped through a watercolor tutorial, or from what I can remember about watercolor basics, typically it's supposed to be used pretty lightly, like with a lot of water and dilution and just with layering, but I don't know, I guess traditionally the look isn't supposed to mimic another medium, which I say all this to kind of get to the point where I actually think I ended up failing at this. Like I thought I was gonna have a light approach sort of, but then in the end I ended up using a lot of layers and I just kept going with it. And then eventually I did decide to bring colored pencils into the mix as well, but you will see all of this shortly. So I didn't want to make this video too long because I specifically just wanted to focus on the process and just kind of highlight the interesting finds that I kind of came across while doing it. So one of the things is, I think it's super handy to have that kneadable eraser that you saw me just use really intensely. So it took off most of the pencil, but because I went lightly in the hair areas and stuff, it's just enough for me to see where the silhouette is, so I can basically finalize the design in the second step, which is a more polished and concrete sketch, or I guess this is like somewhere between a sketch and line work because it is pretty sharp and precise without any really like sketchy lines. So I suppose this is like almost line work, but as you can see I am doing it with a pencil, and I decided to specifically use the Colorase Prismacolor pencils because they tend to partially melt away when you use a water-based medium over them. At least that's what I've noticed in my experience anyways. So yeah, I have quite a big color selection of those that I picked up over the years, and I decided to just use different colors for different parts of the illustrations, which is also not something I typically do. I usually just use one color. Like in the past, I've had the whole sketch just be done or outlined in red or something like that, or like brown. But this time around, because this is actually kind of an atypical color scheme for me, because it has a lot of pinks and blues, those are not colors that I typically use. Yeah, I wanted to just make sure that nothing clashes, and so I went the extra mile and picked different colored pencils for different parts of the illustration. And this is a good time to take a quick pause to tell you guys about this video's sponsor. Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence for your business. I myself have been using Squarespace for my main portfolio website for years, and naturally when I was looking for places to host my original webcomic, Squarespace was my top contender, but I wasn't sure how things were going to go because typically webcomics are hosted using blog style websites, and there's been some complicated coding from what I've heard. But I'm super happy to report that Squarespace was very easy. It was a total breeze. The freeform editor allowed me to create the landing page exactly how I wanted to, with custom button images and a parallax background and a logo as large as I want, which is very large as you can see. So the backhand is very straightforward. Editing and posting new pages is super easy, and the fantastic thing is that I can always add a custom shop directly to the site in the future if I need to. I highly recommend using Squarespace. If you want to try it out for yourself and make a website portfolio or host your webcomic or anything, you can head over to squarespace.com and sign up for a free trial so you can test out all the amazing features. Once you're ready to launch your website, you can go to squarespace.com/cosmicspectrumart for 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. That's squarespace.com/cosmicspectrumart for 10% off. And I knew right off the bat that probably the most difficult part for me in this drawing will be rendering Ekko's skin tone, because previously in the past, like anytime I draw a character with darker skin, it is a little bit more difficult to get an even skin tone with like proper washes. It's especially hard with ink, which is usually what I use, but this time I used watercolor, so it was a little bit easier, and it actually went over a lot better than I expected it to, but still not without difficulties, which I will briefly go over once I get there in the footage. But yeah, as you can see, my second pass with a pencil is a lot more decisive than the first pass, which was basically like the first pass with the mechanical pencil that I used was basically just map out the composition and just kind of put down roughly where everything is. And most of that energy was put towards the faces, like figuring out the facial expressions and being like, I had to erase now and then when I was doing the faces because I wanted to be specific, and then afterwards obviously going over it with the colored pencil was significantly easier because I pretty much solved that. But stuff like secondary details like the hair and whatnot, some of the outfit details, that's the stuff that I left to actually just solve with the colored pencils during second pass, because those things are typically less important, and I think it's just easier to not waste time putting too much work into it on both during both of the first and second step. So yeah, once I finished the second pass on the colored pencils and everything was kind of good to go, and I forgot to mention this, but you probably noticed in the video that I did tape off the drawing, so there will be the tape removal process at the very end, which is like the most satisfying part, I think, of finishing something like this. But in any case, yes. So while I was finishing up the second pencil pass, I was already thinking in the back of my mind, like, what am I going to do first and how am I going to approach coloring this illustration? Because, you know, there are a bunch of different ways that it can be done. For instance, I decided to do a light tonal pass of pink over most of the illustration first. And that's not necessarily, like, some of the other things I considered, like, I thought maybe it would be good to just knock the background out of the way first, just do the black background and whatnot, because that's something I would actually have done first if I was using colored inks. But for whatever reason, I decided to do this light pass of, like, this light tonal pass first. And that's a technique that I picked, or like an approach that I picked up while I was doing some gouache studies over the past couple of years. And I think for the most part it ended up working out, but I do wonder if the result would have looked different if I actually started with something else. So that's, you know, that's something that maybe I'll experiment with a little bit later. But yeah, like I mentioned, just putting down these base tone washes is a technique that I picked up while I was doing gouache studies, and I think I actually learned a lot from doing gouache studies. And while I was working on this, it made me really miss the gouache process, and so that's maybe something that I want to do a little bit more of in the near future. But in any case, a lot of this process was quite experimental, since there's so many ways to do any one effect, or so many different ways of like rendering an effect when you're trying to replicate it. So like, for instance, with the background, there were some details in the scene in the Arcane animation where there was just some lights and like flags in the background, and I wasn't sure how much detail I wanted to put into it. So as you can see, I put down some hints of that in the background, and later I decided that I'll probably just paint around it with black and sort of put some texture in there, like try to blend it in interesting ways to basically make an impression of what the background actually was, but not bother rendering it exactly. So for the most part, that's what I did with like the majority of this process. And of course, since it was kind of a draw this in your style situation where I wasn't trying to replicate the image exactly as it was, I definitely made some changes to it. I think the biggest change I made was Jinx or Powder's hair. So I thought that it was really kind of weirdly flat in the show. I don't know. I guess it made sense, but when I was thinking about it, I'm like, okay, she has these two braids that are super thick, like she's got some thick hair going on, and I thought that there's no way that if she cut it, it would be that flat and volumeless. So in my imagination, I wanted to give her significantly more volume to her hair. Like these are the boring background thoughts that I had. But yeah, and like honestly, if you've seen any of my other work, you can probably tell that I'm a big fan of hair volume and just painting, drawing hair in general. So obviously that was kind of going to be the star of the show, aside from the faces, which I had a very fun time with these facial expressions. They did kind of give me a hard time because they were so I just had to be very careful with the subtlety of the expressions, but I think overall I'm pretty happy with how they turned out. Yes, and then another thing that I thought was kind of funny about the Arcane show, like in the show specifically, Jinx has really dark eyebrows. Powder has really dark eyebrows for some reason, and they're kind of black, like they're really dark. So I was thinking to myself, like, well, it seems like her hair is naturally blue, so then why aren't her eyebrows blue as well? Yeah, these are the questions that were going through my head. So I made them just a little bit blue instead of being fully black like in the show. And yeah, those are some of like the micro choices that I made. But anyways, I digress. So my typical strategy for completing an illustration is I try to put down the base color of all the elements first, and then move on to the more fine details, like adding more depth to the hair or like rendering any specific part. So I did a little bit of rendering on the face, on Jinx's face I keep saying Jinx, it's Powder. Yeah, so I did a little bit of rendering on her face, and then it basically dawned on me that I really shouldn't render anything until I put the background in, because the contrast of the dark background versus having a white background really visually affects what the colors look like, So my thoughts were I definitely have to get the background out of the way first before I actually figure out how to render the rest of the scene properly, because it has to be done in conjunction with the background. And so I did that, which took quite some time and was really testing my patience, even though this drawing is pretty small. Yeah, I figured I should also mention that overall, it didn't take too long. Like, I'm trying to remember how long it took. Maybe like 3 hours or something was the time that it took to finish this. Could have been a little more than that. I can't remember. But I also wanted to mention that actually I wanted to talk about the show itself. So initially I did this illustration and I wanted to use the footage to talk about my thoughts on the show and do like a review situation. And I did actually record the footage for that, recorded the voiceover for that, and I was editing it for days, and it ended up being super long. Like, it was over an hour because I guess I had just a lot to say about it. So you're going to see, like, if you want to watch that, I will also post that video, and it will actually include the entirety of the process without any cuts like you see in this video, but it will be like a sped up version, even though it will be an hour long. So basically I thought that that's a bit of a weird way to use that footage because the video is so long. So it's mostly like just for the background of the review audio, and so I decided to make this video first and post it for you guys so that you can just watch the process, and then I can also explain some things about it and kind of focus on that, and then the other video is mostly about the review of the show. So anyways, back to the process. While I was working on Ekko's face, I think I've managed to put down a pretty good base layer, even with some rendering on his face, but then I kind of hit a wall where I really couldn't get I was getting way more into the specifics of the shadows and whatnot, and I couldn't really do it with paint anymore. So instead I decided to just bring in my trusty old pencil crayons. I use, for the most part, Polychromos Faber-Castell pencils. I have this big set, but as you can see here, I'm also using a little bit of the color erase pencils as well, because those are great. Like, they're a little bit different. So for instance, I don't know, I think the consistency of the pencils is different, so they kind of have a slightly different effect. And plus, even though I have a really big set of Polychromos, sometimes I just don't have the exact color that I'm looking for, so I do use a bit of a mix, including the color erase pencils as well, so you can kind of see me going back and forth between those two. And it worked really well to just add everything that I couldn't do with paint. So I really like mixed media for that reason. And of course I brought in a white gel pen that really kind of tends to pull things together. And for the most part, I think I rendered the majority of Powder's hair with pencil over top of the layer of paint that you saw me put down. And I guess the only thing that I have to say about the paint is I love it. I think it's really nice quality. I would have to probably make a few more illustrations to use other colors to test it out thoroughly, but the only thing that I thought was weird was that it had a few pastel colors which had clearly white mixed into them, and I'm not sure how I feel about watercolors having white pigment mixed into them because it makes them ever so slightly opaque, and that's not something that I'm used to. But other than that, it was great. I really love the set. I'm glad that I finally have some new watercolors because the ones that I've been using previously are just like super old. And yes, this was a good test. I'm pretty pleased with how it turned out. I think it's a little bit below my standards in general, but you know, there's always a gap in skills and imagination. So hopefully with more studies, I'll be able to kind of own in on a better technique, but for the most part I'm happy with how it turned out. I like these new paints, and I really hope you guys enjoyed watching this process, and I hope you maybe try something like this for yourself as well, because it kind of covers all bases, and I think it's easier to get the desired effect from a mixed media situation than to just use one medium. So yeah, thank you for watching this video, and I will see you in my next one. Bye!